All right, how's everybody doing today? All fired up for the last couple of weeks of school? Yes? No? Tired? Weary, maybe? Is that a better way to describe it?
Yeah.
How was everybody's break? Did everybody have a good time for the Thanksgiving break? Who traveled the farthest? So, yes, how far did you go?
I went out the country.
Really? Where'd you go?
Canada.
Where?
Canada.
Canada? Anyone go further than Canada? Okay, then you win. I would say you win a prize, but I'm having a fire sale here at the end of this semester. I just dumped everything from the supplies in the office into the bucket, so help yourself to one of those if you'd like. Okay, so a couple things. So, of course, on Thanksgiving, the Bears beat the Lions, despite the fact that Trubisky was hurt, our quarterback. I had to go to great lengths to get the game because we stayed in a cabin in Packwood and it didn't have a full cable subscription. We couldn't figure out how to get the game on the TV. So then I logged into my Xfinity account and it wouldn't let me watch it because I can only stream on Xfinity in my house apparently. And so then I went and you can go and on CBS will sell you a subscription to its channel, to watch its channel. So for $5 I bought a 1-month subscription to CBS's channel and I was able to get the game. So that was crisis averted. And how did basketball do? You guys won, right?
We won.
You won. How about men's also?
1, 2, 3.
Great. All right. Good job. All right. That's good. All right. So a couple things. First of all, I sent an announcement out about this, and you're going to get tired of me talking about this week and next week. But please take a few minutes to complete the end of course survey. These are very important. I know you're getting one in every class. I get that, and I know you got other things to do, and you probably think, I don't have time for these surveys. But I do have to tell you that we pay attention to them very closely. Personally, I use them every semester. I take my surveys. I go through each one of them, and I read every comment, and I make a plan then for the next semester. Obviously, sometimes I'll get one comment that'll say, I love the book, and then one comment will say, I hate the book. And so obviously I can't satisfy both of those comments. But to the extent that I can satisfy anybody's concerns, I try to do so. My class has not been the same anytime I've taught it, and it's largely driven by the feedback that I get in the survey. And then, so that's personally, but also just generally, we at the School of Business and at the university look at these. They're important both for the evaluation of faculty, for our job evaluations, and they're important for the School of Business and the university to find ways that we can constantly improve. So hopefully with that, I've convinced you to take a few minutes to give us your feedback. If not, I always throw out one extra offer here, and that is that my goal is 100% participation in the survey every year. And so if we get 100% participation in your class, and it's by section, so you don't have to worry about the other class, but if I get 100% participation, I'll give everyone an extra credit. So, and that's in addition to any other extra credit points. If you've maxed them out or whatever, it's a free extra credit point for everyone if I get 100% participation. So I get a report every couple days, and so we'll check in on Tuesday morning and see how our percentages are going. You have until the start of class on our last day of class. So in this case, 8 o'clock on the 6th, 8 a.m. on the 6th is when it will cut off. So please take the time to complete those. Executive Leadership Series, last one is tonight. So if you want to go, that's tonight at 6 o'clock. And I'm not going to be able to go because I have to leave. I have to be out the door tomorrow. I think I figured it out at 4 o'clock to get to the airport because my flight is at 6 something. And So I don't know if you've ever experienced this problem. Has anybody ever taken one of those flights, one of the first flights out, and you've been to the security lines? You've seen the security lines at SeaTac? No troubles?
Oh, I didn't fly.
Oh. So SeaTac has the same problem that Orange County has when I used to fly a lot out of Orange County, and that is that there's noise restrictions. So they're not supposed to take off until a certain time. And so what happens is all the airlines have a flight leaving first thing in the morning. And this was true at Orange County Airport. So if you have one of these first flights out, everyone's trying to get to the flight at the same time. And so the security lines are super, super long at 5 o'clock in the morning. So you have to actually be there even earlier, and they don't have as many security lines open. So it's all these people trying to get on these planes that are all leaving at the same time, going through, one of the security lines. When we flew to Peru last year for the MBA trip, we had one of these 6 a.m. flights, and the line, they had one security line open, and it had, all the switchbacks like this, back and forth, and then it went back out around to the ticketing area, and then went back in and had more switchbacks, and I mean, it went on forever. So just a little word of advice: if you ever have one of those early flights out of SeaTac, get there even earlier than you think you need to be there. So I'm out the door very early Wednesday morning. Don't forget, got the office visits. That's before the last day of class, and then any extra credit reflections are due Friday. So if you've gone to any of the extra credit presentations and have yet to fill out the reflections, please do that by Friday, because what I like to do is enter them all once, and then give you still a chance to see to make sure I got it right, because invariably I miss one here or there or something. So I need there to be enough time for me to enter it into the gradebook so you can see it and we can make any corrections before we get to the end of class. My goal always is to have pretty much everything in the book as possible on the last day of class. The only thing, of course, that will be outstanding on the last day of class will be the final blog post, which you're only turning in that day. So I'll have that done by the following week, and then the module test, the last module test, but that's graded automatically, so that should go quickly. So pretty much should have pretty much everything in there to know what your grade is, except for the last blog post component and the module test, and I usually have all of that done by the week after. So I don't like to drag out the grading thing any longer than I have to. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Plug in my little device here. Okay. All right. Okay, so this week, this is our last substantive topic that we'll be covering, which is bankruptcy, the sort of the exclamation point on everything we've been talking about in this whole class. We are not meeting on Thursday, in case you don't already know that, just as a reminder. The ethics essay number 2 is due on Thursday, and then next week, which is dead week, we'll use both classes, Tuesday and Thursday, for activity classes, activity work, so we'll do some review, and then the last blog post draft is due, the final draft is due before class on the 6th, which is a week from Thursday. And then the last exam will open on the 6th and close on the 13th. Okay, so that's the remaining work left to do in the class. Any questions on that or anything else so far? Okay, any other questions or anything else that you want to talk about before we get started? Okay. All right, so I got 2 jokes for you, and I'm really bottom of the barrel here now, really at the very last ones. So let's see what we've got. Why does California have the most lawyers and New Jersey the most toxic waste dumps? Anybody know? Make a little fun of our friends in New Jersey. Okay, New Jersey had the first choice. They'd rather have toxic waste dumps than lawyers, right? Okay. What do you have if 3 lawyers are buried up to their necks in cement? Yeah.
Not enough cement.
Not enough cement. Right. Good one. Okay. So that's been used before, right? That's a that you can, some of these jokes get recycled, it is for other professions. So, all right. Okay, let's talk about bankruptcy. Let's see, where are we? This way. Okay. Okay, so one more time, we're looking at our graphic, and we've made our way from the center out to the outside. So we are finally in this red box that surrounds everything we've been talking about, and that is the topic of bankruptcy. So we've actually made our way. If you look back, we started with how the legal system works in the United States. We looked at ethics. We looked at how you form a business entity, the different kinds of business entities, and agency relationships. And that was sort of the core of what we started with. And then we went and looked at how does all of this apply to certain areas of the law. So property, intellectual property, personal property, real property. We looked at employment and how all of these core relationships work. Employment being, of course, an example of agency. Insurance, another essentially form of agency, but also a form of contract. And then we, of course, looked at contracts, which layers over all of this. But hopefully you can sort of see the theory here that we have this core set of material that then applies to how businesses operate. So this is sort of the core, that the underlying foundation. This is how businesses operate every day. These are the things businesses need to deal with that involve the law. And then we finally get to what happens when it doesn't work out, when we fail. And that's where we are with bankruptcy. If we didn't have this red line enclosing everything, then you wouldn't have the degree of certainty, or at least certainty is probably not the right word, but it would be harder to calculate the end risk that you face. It would also be difficult for debtors to start over and resolve their debts and start fresh. Okay, so bankruptcy does those two things. So we're going to talk about what bankruptcy is, what we mean by that term, both financially and legally, and then we're going to look at two examples. We'll dive into both Lehman Brothers and Sears as two examples of kind of two different ways that a company can fail and fall into bankruptcy. At the end of the day, it's the same thing happened. They filed for bankruptcy, and in Lehman's case, the company was liquidated, and my guess is that same fate faces Sears, although they're trying to save the company in bankruptcy. And then we'll look at the three different chapters, 7, 11, and 13. Okay, we'll do a little comparison of those. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so I already mentioned this is our final substantive topic. So after this, it's just review and activities. I always have this. I always say this. Make this comment about bankruptcy, and that is that bankruptcy's always there. You always have to be thinking about it. And this is true whether you're a company that's filing bankruptcy, whether you're a company that's close to filing bankruptcy, or even whether you're a company that's nowhere near it. You still have to deal with it. You still have to think about it. You still have to account for it, because it is the system of rules that will determine, if you're the company, if you're a creditor, will determine whether and when and how you get paid. So calculating that risk of non-payment is important even when you are the creditor, right? So banks certainly spend a lot of their time thinking about bankruptcy. Sellers of goods on credit spend a lot of time thinking about bankruptcy. The lenders of any kind, not just banks, but lenders of any kind have to think about this. So does everybody who sues somebody. If you sue somebody, we talked about this back here in how the legal system works, right? If you sue someone, and is that an expensive or an inexpensive proposition to sue somebody? You think it's cheap? No, it's very expensive. And just as a review, after you undertake this expensive process, what do you get? What does the court give you? Does it give you your money back? No, what does it give you? Anybody remember? There's a term for it. It's called a judgment, which is basically just a piece of paper. And that piece of paper allows the creditor, the plaintiff, to go try and collect on that judgment, to try to collect the money that they won in the case. And if the defendant files for bankruptcy, the judgment creditor is an unsecured creditor. We'll talk about that later in priority. Is it relatively low on the priority list? So it's possible that you could be absolutely right about your claim. You could spend the money to go win your case. You could get your judgment and you could collect zero. And that happens all the time. So this is why even when neither party is talking about bankruptcy, if you're thinking about suing somebody else, you have to account for the fact that you might never collect that money. So whether the judgment is collectible has a lot to do with whether you actually even file a lawsuit. And in many cases, when a company fails to pay, they have other problems. There's some reason that they're not paying you. It's not like they have a ton of money in the bank and just are choosing not to pay, although that does happen. But if somebody defaults on an obligation, they have other problems, which probably means that a judgment is less collectible than it would have been. So even a plaintiff in a case has to think about this. It goes into the calculus of whether you even try to pursue a claim, even if you have a great case. I have to have this conversation with clients all the time. They come in and they say, this person screwed me out of my money. I want to pursue it. And, I don't do that kind of thing. I've never done that kind of work. But I'll explain to them, you have to do the math. It's going to cost you, and I may have mentioned this to you before, but there's a no man's land in between zero and how much it is worth to actually pursue a claim. And I'll have people that'll come in, they were stiffed for $25,000. And I will almost always say, it's not worth it. Walk away, you're better off going and doing something else with your time and your money than investing money to try to collect $25,000. So that's part of the math of how the system works. So the concept, the idea that somebody who owes you money, that they might not pay, and that you might never be able to collect from them, is always part of the calculus. And it's why you have to make sure that you're making enough money on the sales of your products to compensate you for the risk that you're taking. I see it all the time in business plans that clients bring to me. They assume a certain number of sales, and they always assume 100% collections. Not always, but a lot of startup companies will assume that. And you can never assume that. You're never going to collect 100% of your sales if you're selling anything on credit. Okay, one of the things we're going to look at here today is there's different ways, different kinds of events that can lead to bankruptcy. And we're going to see that in the difference between Lehman and Sears. They both ultimately failed, but they failed because of for different reasons. And we'll look at that here in a little bit. The point of this is to remember there are multiple ways to fail. It's not all the same thing. It doesn't always happen the same way. And then the last thing I want you to think about is this idea that bankruptcy is sometimes a strategy. One example of this, and although I don't, as time goes by, I need to find a better example, but our current president is famous for this, actually. What he was famous for doing was it's actually, relatively smart strategy if you look at it this way, is isolating assets into companies that were remote from his other companies. So that if they failed, for example, Taj Mahal in New Jersey, going back to New Jersey, does anybody know the story of the Taj Mahal? Donald Trump's casino there? Anybody know this? Okay, because because it doesn't exist anymore, but he built this massive casino in New Jersey. It was literally called the Taj Mahal, and it was decorated that way. And it was an abysmal failure. It bombed. He used tons of borrowed money, and it just never made enough money to pay the debt. And so he bankrupted it. But all of his other assets were isolated from that business, so that he just bankrupted that business, stiffed the lenders for what he borrowed, and continued to run the rest of his businesses largely unaffected by it. The one effect that it did have, and this is something that you need to think about when you think about bankruptcy as a strategy, is it made it very difficult for him to borrow from traditional sources. And it ultimately led to his connection with the Russians, because he needed to get his capital financing for his business. He can't go to traditional banks anymore because he's known as somebody who has filed bankruptcy and didn't repay. So he had to go to other sort of non-traditional sources of money, and he tapped into what they call national wealth funds of Russia and Arab countries. So the point that I'm making is that you can actually use bankruptcy as a weapon, as a strategy. We used to use it. I told you the story about our airplane. Didn't I tell you that story last time? I want to say I did.
Yes.
About the jet.
Yeah.
And so what we said remember we had this lease, we're talking about it because of leases, right? We had this lease, and the lease payments, the total remaining lease payments were more than the jet was worth. And so we were trying to get the leasing company to take a haircut, as it's called a haircut, take less than they're owed. And they refused to do it. And so what we said, we have to be careful, because you're not permitted to use bankruptcy overtly as a threat, but we used it inadvertently, or I don't know what the right word is, but not directly, indirectly. And what we said to them was, look, you can continue to take payments from us if you want, but you're going to have to get in line behind everybody else if we don't pay. And what that meant, what we were telegraphing to them, was we might file bankruptcy. And if we do that, then you're going to have to get in line behind everybody else, meaning priority of payment, and you're going to end up getting the jet back and selling it, and you're going to get exactly what we're offering you now, which is the value of the jet, the haircut on your payments. And that's fine, except for the fact that they called our bluff. They said, okay, we'll take that risk. And ultimately we ended up, because we didn't file bankruptcy, we ended up paying off the lease. We paid it down until the lease payments were less than the jet was worth, and then we sold the jet and paid off the lease. So that's the problem with using it, because I always get this when we talk about bankruptcy in this class. Well, that sounds like a great deal. I'll go spend a bunch of money, borrow a bunch of money to buy something, and then I'll just file bankruptcy, and I'll just walk away from it, and I'll have all the stuff, and I won't owe the money, and I'll be great, right? I'll just use bankruptcy for that reason. Well, it doesn't always work that way. First of all, it destroys your credit, makes it difficult to borrow again, like what happened to Donald Trump. And second of all, sometimes the parties that you're dealing with may or may not play ball with you. The other thing, which we'll talk about in a minute as well, and someone mentioned this in the forums in the other class, there are some debts that you cannot discharge in bankruptcy. Does anybody know what one of the big categories of debts that you can't discharge in bankruptcy?
Student loans.
Student loans. That's right. So you can run up student loans, and if you can't pay them back, you can file for bankruptcy, but you're still going to owe the debt after bankruptcy. You can't walk away from it like you can with credit cards or other kinds of debt. Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions so far on bankruptcy before we get into some examples? Okay. All right, so okay. Everybody remember this? I've used it, I think, last time, and I use it over and over again because I like the visual of the balance sheet of a company. So remember again that what is the balance sheet formula again? Anybody remember? There's actually two versions of it. What's the formula? Assets equals liabilities plus equity. And then the other formula, the other version of this that does the same thing. Anybody remember? Anybody? Okay, assets minus liabilities equals equity. Okay, so the point of this first version of it is that the financing for assets comes either from equity or debt, right? Or some mixture of the two. And that's the only place, it's the only way you can acquire an asset if you're a company is to use money that your shareholders gave you or money that you borrowed from a bank or some other lender. Okay, so you either have equity or debt, and the two are how you acquire your assets. The second formula tells a different story. It says that what the equity holders get, what the shareholders get after you sell the assets and pay the debt holders is this, right? So this is the portion of the assets that the shareholders own because the debt holders get paid first. So if you liquidate the assets, you pay the debt first, and then the shareholders get what's left. It's the residual ownership of the assets. Okay, so this second version of the formula kind of tells the bankruptcy story. Because that's what bankruptcy does. Bankruptcy says, liquidation anyway, says we're going to sell all the assets, pay all the debt, and then whatever's left, if anything, goes to the shareholders. Now in a diagram like this, you would, if you're a shareholder, do you expect to get something back? Do you expect that if we liquidate this company, you're going to get some money? If you're one of the shareholders and the company looks like this, roughly 50-50 financing, would you expect to get money?
Yeah.
Yes? And why? Why would you expect to get money?
Well, the asset is two times the liability.
Right, because the assets are 2 times the liability, so there should be plenty of money to pay the debt and return some money to the shareholders. Now, is anybody here on accounting concentration? Anybody in the accounting concentration? I'm going to put you on the spot if you are. No? Okay. All right. So, basic rule of accounting, what value do assets go on the balance sheet? When you buy and when you put an asset on the balance sheet, what number do you put in the asset column, do you think? So let's say you're buying a $50 million airplane, a jet, right? You take $50 million of cash. Let's just assume that you're going to pay all cash for it. You take $50 million of cash and you buy the jet for $50 million. How do you book that transaction, do you think? Yes?
You mean like the historical cost?
Well, the cost on the balance sheet. So let's say we start off with cash of $50 million. And this is an isolated example. So there's other liabilities and other assets, but we're going to isolate this example. So we start off with cash, we have no debt, and we have $50 million in equity. Okay? So we have $50 million of shareholder money that's sitting in the bank. Now, if we buy a jet and we pay all cash, how does this look? Yeah.
Your cash would go down to zero because you spent $50 million on it.
Right.
But then your equipment or property, which would also be an asset, would then increase by 50.
Right. So you would have airplane, which is an asset, is $50 million, and now you're back in balance, right? So the airplane goes on the balance sheet at cost. And this is important to understand. This is a very important thing to understand about accounting, even if you're not an accounting major. All assets are on the balance sheet at cost. Now, what do we know about the value of assets? Can you always get back what you paid for them? Okay, sometimes you can get back more, right? There are such things as appreciating assets. Real estate would be an example of that. Some stock could be an example of that. But an airplane that you buy brand new for $50 million is probably going to be worth what, more or less. Right. But it's still on the balance sheet for what you paid for it. You might choose to write it down. You can write it down, but never up. So most assets are on the balance sheet at what they cost because that balances the formula, but they are not necessarily what they're worth. And if you're a company who's in trouble and trying desperately to sell assets, you get more or less than the market value of the asset that you're trying to sell, you think? If you're fire saling assets. Less, right? Yeah. So it's even less. So this is the problem with this diagram. When we look at the balance sheet of a company, in all likelihood, these assets are worth far less than what they're on the books for. And if the yellow box shrinks, which box on the right side shrinks in proportion? Equity, exactly. So the risk of depreciating assets is on the equity holders first. Well, what happens if the assets shrink even further than the equity that we have? What if this box now is the same size as the red box? Then what happens? Let's say you sell all these assets and they're only worth 50 cents on the dollar. Who's going to get paid? Right. Anybody who's in this box gets paid, and the equity gets wiped out. Shareholders get nothing. What happens if this box shrinks to where it's even smaller than this one? Then what happens? Bankruptcy, yeah, that's right. Who gets paid?
Priority.
Yeah, right. So debt holders in order of priority. So the way to think about this is the further down you are in this column, and really all equity for the most part is the same, although there is such thing as what we call preferred stock. Preferred stock kind of sits at the top of the equity box. But leaving that out for a second, let's pretend that this is a rank order of priority, both in the equity and the debt. As the asset box shrinks, it shrinks up, and it starts eating away at the equity. And then it starts eating away at the lower priority liabilities. So the more the assets are devalued, the higher up it chews up into the capital structure of the company. And ultimately, if you're at the very top of the liabilities box, you might get paid if there's anything at all there. But as you get further down the box, the liabilities box, it's less likely that you're going to get paid. Okay, so with that, what do you think? What kind of return do you think somebody down here is expecting versus a return that someone at the very top of the liabilities box is expecting? Who needs to be paid more for their risk they're taking? This is like a really key fundamental concept in finance, but that everyone needs to understand. Yeah.
I guess, but I'd say equity because it's an investment. Like,
Yeah, it is.
Well, I just thought that they're trying to get more out of it. They're not just trying to break even. I thought.
Right. Okay. So when you make an equity investment, you're expecting more than just a fixed rate of return, right? That's what debt holders are expecting. So you're expecting a greater rate of return, but you're expecting that because of why? Because what's the
Fear to greater risk to lose money.
Absolutely. So the further down the box you get, the higher risk, which means it's the more that you need to get paid. So if you issue common stock, the lowest priority equity, you have to be able, at least in theory, the shareholders are going to expect, they're going to price your stock based on an expectation of return that is going to be higher than anything that's above them in this box. So preferred stock is going to get paid less, has a lower rate of return than common stock because it has a higher priority. Unsecured debt, or debt that's the lowest priority, costs the most. And the higher up you get on the liability box, the lower you pay in interest. So this is, and this is all because of the risk of bankruptcy, right? Because anyone who lends money to this company and who gets it at the very top is going to charge the lowest rate, at least until things get nasty, and then the formula turns upside down. But you think about it as a risk and return proposition. So this is the riskiest investment and should get the highest return. This is the lowest risk investment that should get the lowest rate of return. So when you're borrowing, if you have, first of all, lots of great assets, and if you're willing to pledge them for a loan, and you don't have a whole bunch of other debt that's already there, you're going to pay a lot less money for debt than if you are lending towards the bottom of the liability box and depending on the size of your asset box. Okay, so keep this in mind because it explains a lot about how business works. Yeah.
So is it like a normal tactic, probably illegal to write that you have less assets than you have in reality? Like if this airplane is worth $50 million and you just write it's $30 million,
Yeah.
you have to give less money if you go bankrupt?
Okay.
Or like this is a normal tactic?
Right. Well, here's the problem. If you spend $50 million of cash to buy a $50 million airplane, in order for your balance sheet to balance, it has to be on the books as at $50 million. Now, what you can do is you can write down the value of the asset. You can say, well, it's worth only 30, so what we're going to do is write this down to 30 million now. We're going to take a depreciation expense of $20 million, but now we're out of balance. So what do we have to do to bring this back into balance? Yeah, the depreciation expense goes on the income statement, which then will cause a $20 million loss, which then you put back here, and now you bring this down to $30 million. So you have to write down both the equity and the asset in order to do that. And companies don't want to do that because they don't want to take a $20 million loss, right? What's
I
that?
was just gonna say there's so many creative ways of doing depreciation.
Yeah,
Because you can use depreciation, a different method of depreciation for like tax purposes versus like recording like the
Yeah.
book value of assets.
Right.
So,
right. And so you bring up a good point, and that is we commonly think about, generally it's considered fraud if you have two sets of books, right? But really every company has two sets of books. They have the financial calculations and then the tax calculations, because there's some expenses that you take that are not deductible as expenses. There's some assets that have to be considered at a certain value for taxes and different value for the GAAP accounting. So every company has two sets of books, that one for taxes and one for accounting purposes. So you're right. You spend. Big public company has armies of people that do nothing but deal with this all the time. Okay, but I wanted to make sure that we had a good grounding in how the balance sheet works. And honestly, this is something that you should take from this class, and not just for purposes of business law, but this explains, like I just said a few minutes ago, but this explains a lot. It explains how businesses function in so many different ways. If you understand this basic intuition, you understand a lot about how businesses work and why things are the way they are. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples, because I want to show you how using this visual, what happened to Lehman Brothers versus what happened to Sears. And there's some commonality, but there's also a lot that's different between them. In the case of Lehman Brothers, at the end of 2000, they went bankrupt in 2008, right? It was just the anniversary of it. It was in, I think it was September, October of 2008. So, but at the end of 2007 was its most profitable year in its history. So it made more money in 2007 than it made ever before. And then 9 months later, it was bankrupt. Sears is a little bit different story, right? Sears, we've talked a little bit about them. They were the Amazon of their era. biggest retailer in the country, had the biggest building in the country, in the Sears Tower in Chicago. They were massive, made tons and tons of money, but slowly over time, they got caught up in this sort of general retail, what they call the retail apocalypse, which is if you go through a store, a mall anymore, you see a lot of empty stores, a lot of closed up stores because these retailers are just getting crushed by Amazon and internet sales. I just heard yesterday was Cyber Monday, right? And it was something like $7 billion or something yesterday, one day in retail sales. Retail sale, internet now is 10% of all retail sales in the United States, 10%. So that's a big number of people that are shopping in places other than places like Sears. Okay, so let's look at Lehman first. Lehman was the largest bankruptcy in American history. Before it, Enron was the largest, and Lehman was like twice as big. But Lehman's formula looked a little different because, and I mentioned this I think last week, their box looked kind of like this. Okay, so this is what they look like. Now, what Lehman was a investment bank, and they made money in trading, buying and selling assets. And they did it almost entirely with borrowed money. The ratio was 40-to-1. So for every dollar of equity, they had $40 of debt. So they were, well, this is what we call a very highly leveraged business. But they were borrowing in the commercial paper market. And what did we learn about commercial paper? What kinds of companies get to borrow in the commercial paper market, usually? Anybody remember from that discussion? Starbucks is, yeah. Really big companies, well-known companies with really great credit. Okay, so, but how risky does this look to you? How risky does this chart look relative to the one that we just saw before? Is this riskier or more or less risky? More. It's a lot more risky, right? Because it doesn't take a whole lot of degradation of the assets before you start carving into the debt. Right? And remember that the deal with debt is, the deal with equity is you might lose your money, and everybody who invests in equity knows that. With debt, it's a contract that says you're going to get paid a fixed amount of return and you're going to get paid back. You have a contractual obligation to be paid to pay back. You don't have that with shareholders. You don't owe them their money back necessarily, right? So it's a different kind of investment. But it doesn't take a whole lot for this box to start eating into the debt that's available. And that's exactly what happened to Lehman. And it happened extremely quickly. Because what most of these assets were subprime mortgages or securities backed by subprime mortgages. And what happened was the assets, the value of the assets fell really dramatically and really quickly. So they had trillions of dollars, billions of dollars of these securities, and once the economy started to slow down, borrowers started to default on the loans, on the mortgages. And if you default on a mortgage, does the bank always get all their money back? Yeah, sometimes they do, but what do you think has to happen in a mortgage for the bank to get all of its money back, usually? That's a version of this formula. So if I bought my house and I borrowed against it and I stopped paying, what's the bank going to do? Foreclose. They're going to take my house, and then what are they going to do?
Sell it.
They're going to sell it, and what are they going to do with the proceeds of the sale?
Don't keep it.
You know, they pay themselves back, right? And if they collect more from the sale than I owe them, I get that extra. Okay, but does that ever happen really? Yeah, probably not. So what protects a bank from taking a loss, or at least what helps them reduce their loss? What feature of the loan needs to be in place to protect them? Anybody? How does a bank protect themselves?
Like insurance?
Oh, insurance is one way, yeah, that's one way they might do it. That's more likely in the case of like a fire or a flood or something. But what happens if the borrower just doesn't pay? Yeah, there is some insurance for that, default insurance, but how does a bank protect itself when it lends against a house? Yeah, collateral, exactly. And what is the collateral? What is the collateral on a bank loan, on a mortgage loan? The house. And so how much do they lend, do you think? So let's do this again. Let's take this on a smaller scale. How much would you think, how big should this box be to protect yourself if you're this bank? You're lending, this asset is a house. How much would you lend against it, do you think? Let's say it's worth $100,000. Make the math really easy. How much would you lend? How much would you lend to this borrower to buy a $100,000 asset? Yeah?
80.
80, okay, which is typical for what we call a prime loan, agency paper loan. That would be, let's say 80%, so we'll call this 80K, which gives $20,000, there's $20,000 of equity in this house. So if in a foreclosure, the bank can suffer 20% loss in the value of the house and still get paid, right? That's how mortgages normally work. And notice this looks exactly the same. So you think about it, there's about 1 million of these in here. Okay, so it's just the same formula over and over again. But what Lehman was doing in the real estate bubble, and what a lot of them were doing, was this. They were lending sometimes, they were doing this. They were lending $100,000 to a borrower to buy a $100,000 house, which leaves how much margin for error? 0. And if this borrower defaults and we suffer a loss to sell the house, then the bank is going to take that loss on this asset, right? And what happened in 2007 is this happened en masse, which meant that there were a whole bunch of houses being foreclosed on, and a whole bunch of houses then being sold on a fire sale. And when there's a huge amount of sellers relative to buyers, what happens to prices? They drop, which means this was even worse. Okay, so now imagine this times 1 million, and what happened here was this box got really small really fast. And when that happened, the lender stopped lending and Lehman went bankrupt almost overnight. It's amazing how fast it happened, because they were borrowing from a market that assumed that they were a creditworthy borrower. And as soon as the market got spooked about their ability to repay, all these loans came due, and nobody would lend them any more money, and they failed. And there's a great, it's too long to assign in the class. There's a great movie about this. There's actually a dramatization and a documentary where they show there's this one weekend where this happened, and they tried to save Lehman, and the only way to do it would have been for the government to step in and guarantee all this debt, which the government wasn't willing to do. Yeah.
They got bought out for $2 a share.
Oh, that was Bear Stearns. Yeah, this same thing happened to Bear Stearns earlier in the year.
Yeah.
And what happened was the government came in and said, because Chase bought them. Yeah, and the government said, we'll back up these, we'll back up these assets. Right, and so they did it for Bear Stearns, and then the economy kept going and kept going, and then finally Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time, said, we can't do it anymore. And besides, Lehman was like twice the size of Bear. So it would have been billions and billions and billions of taxpayer money would have had to go in and basically stand behind these assets in order for a company like, Bank of America or somebody like that to step in and buy Lehman. It was so bad. It was way worse than anyone thought, and they were so highly leveraged that it just was too big of a problem to solve. Okay, so that's why they went bankrupt. So this was a company that made more money than it ever had made before in 2007 and was bankrupt in 2008 because the assets lost their value so quickly and they had too much debt relative to their assets. Okay, so warning, be careful about debt. In go times, you love it because it makes you more profitable. Each one of these assets makes money. And so the more assets you have, the more profitable you are, the more money you make. And so there's a pressure to borrow money and acquire more assets, take more risk. But when the economy turns down, if you don't have equity to support you, then you lose money really quickly and you go bankrupt really quickly. So that's exactly what happened in this case, was just way too much debt for assets that devalued way too quickly. Okay, and that's what happened to them. All right, so let's take our break, and when we come back, we'll talk about Sears. Okay, so just to give you a sense of scale, let me first. Okay, so when Lehman Brothers filed bankruptcy, they had $639 billion of assets on their books and $619 billion worth of debt. Okay, this is with a B. Enron, prior to Lehman, was the biggest bankruptcy in United States history. They had $63 billion of assets when they filed bankruptcy. 63 and 639, 100 times larger. Sears, which is the biggest bankruptcy lately, has only $7.2 billion in assets. So to give you just a sense of scale, relative to Lehman, I mean, I'm way off scale here. The Lehman would have to go up, 10 feet relative to the Sears bankruptcy. That's how big it was. And so when, we talk about why did the markets, the commercial paper markets seize up when Lehman went bankrupt, it was because this number was just so big. $600 billion in assets and liabilities that were now, based on assets that were way overvalued. So immediately, a lot of this debt became worth, just pennies on the dollar, like overnight. So let's look. We can't look at the Lehman balance sheet, or I couldn't find it easily. I mean, it's available. I just I had trouble finding it last time I was looking for it. But all bankruptcy filings are public, so you can actually go look at the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy filing if you want to, and look at their disclosures and all that. I just didn't have time to do it. But here is Sears, just to give you a sense of what the balance sheet of a bankrupt company looks like. So if you look at the kinds of assets that it has, so it has some cash, although really very little cash. And this is usually what tips a company into bankruptcy, is when the cash runs low. Because if you have payroll due and you don't have a way to pay it and nobody's lending you money because they think you're going to go bankrupt and they don't want to lend you money and not get paid, then you can't pay your employees, you can't pay your rent, you can't pay your basic expenses, and you have to stop doing business. And that's what tips companies into bankruptcy sometimes, because then there's what's called the automatic stay, which is an automatic order by the court that stops all creditors from collecting until the debtor can deal with the bankruptcy filing. So it's a way for companies to survive. There's also a market, and I think I may have told you this before, for what we call debtor in possession financing, which is a lender can come in and lend money to a bankrupt company to finance them during the bankruptcy, and in exchange for that, they get put at the very top, ahead of all the other existing debt holders. So there's an actual market for this debtor in possession financing. They get a very high rate of interest and a very high likelihood of collecting. Okay, so banks like to do those kinds of loans. So look, they have 182, let's see, this is usually in millions, right? No, it's in thousands. So 182 million in cash. Receivables, meaning money that's owed to them, $343 million. Look at this though, this number, $2.7 billion worth of inventory. So all the stuff in all the stores that they have is on the books for 2.7, almost $2.8 billion. Now, what happens, has anybody seen this when stores, like remember Sports Authority when they went bankrupt, and Borders and all these other companies, what you see these sign twirlers on the corner saying, you know, store closing, liquidation sale, and what does the sign usually say? What's that? 70% off, you know, like the first day it's 25, then it's 50, then it's 75. Okay, well, all that stuff that they're selling is on the books at what price? Well, what's it on the books for? What they paid for it. And if they're selling it at 75% off, are they getting back what they paid for it? No. So when you liquidate a company, this number gets really small really quickly. And that's what's happening to Sears right now. They're closing stores, liquidating inventory, and it's making this number even smaller, which eats into the debt or the equity even further. Okay, so current assets, meaning assets that are either cash or can be converted to cash inside of a short period of time, are $3.8 billion. They have a lot of long-term assets though too, because their total assets are $7.2 billion, but they own $1 billion worth of property, plant, and equipment. They own a lot of their stores. In fact, when Eddie Lampert bought Sears a few years ago, some people thought he was just going to buy it, close the stores, and sell all the real estate. And if he'd have done that, at that time, he would have made a ton of money because the real estate was worth more than the company. Intangible assets. What do we know are intangible assets? What is an example of an intangible asset? Looking back.
Their brands they own.
Brands, right? And what brands do they own?
Anymore.
Yeah, Kenmore, Craftsman, the Sears brand itself has some value.
They sold most of those.
They sold it, yeah, because they needed cash. So they started selling assets. The first sign that a company is in trouble when they start selling the valuable assets they have to raise cash, which then reduces their profitability. It saves them in the short run, but it's a long-term, it hurts the business. But intangible assets, those are intangible, right? How much is the Sears brand worth right now? Very little, right? In the Toys R Us bankruptcy, the most valuable thing that company had was the brand name. In fact, somebody bought it, and they're going to reopen some stores with the Toys R Us brand. So anyway, $7.2 billion in assets. But as we know, the real number of what we're going to get if they liquidate this company is far less than that. Now, how much do they owe, though? So their liabilities are massive. They owe $10 billion in total liabilities. So the box looks like this. And the actual shareholders' equity in this company is a negative $5 billion. So if you're a shareholder in this company, what odds do you have of collecting anything? Yeah, it's zero, right? And the stock trades, it stopped trading on October 23rd, but it trades at 36.5 cents, which basically is the price of the commission on a sale. So if you were to buy it, or if you were to sell it, you basically would get nothing. It's basically worth nothing, okay? Which makes obvious sense. Now, how did this happen? So what's different about the Sears bankruptcy from the Lehman bankruptcy? What differences do you notice or can you think of between the two? What kind of company was Lehman before they went bankrupt? Were they doing fairly well, right? They were on top of the world in 2007, one of the most profitable companies on Wall Street. That was not the case with Sears, right? It's been a long time since Sears has made any money. So one big difference is the time frame. Lehman happened very quickly. Sears happened slowly. It was kind of a slow train wreck over time. and which we've been all sort of watching, right? When was the last time anybody has ever bought anything at Sears? Does anybody go there? Yeah?
I got like my mini fridge for like the one there.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right, good. So anybody else?
It was cheap.
Yeah, yeah.
He's got like appliances there.
Okay, so couple of you, yeah? Appliances?
Yes, my mom bought most of our appliances in the scratch and dent.
Oh, from, right, scratch and dent, because they have a store, they actually have a scratch and dent store.
Yeah, there's
in
one
Tacoma.
in Tacoma and there's one up in Seattle.
Right. So, it's interesting, a scratch and dent store is an asset that they're selling, that has some damage to it. They probably damaged it, and they're selling it at less than what they probably paid to produce it, right? So, that's one example of showing you how their inventory is not worth as much as it was. But what we noticed by the fact that very few of us, some of us have, but very few of us have shopped at Sears recently, and that's been their problem, is that they have these big expensive stores that they own, they're expensive to close, and fewer people are coming into them, meaning they have to offer more and more discounts. Luke, you said you bought your fridge there because it was cheap, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the reason that you went there, the reason is because it was cheap, meaning that smaller margins, right, less profitable, and over time it eroded the assets of the business. It just grew and grew. The amount of debt they needed to survive grew and grew, and it eroded away the assets so that it's actually a negative net worth company. And it's the only reason it's still around at all is because Eddie Lampert, who is the hedge fund guy who bought it, kept putting money into it in a way that it probably would have never gotten that money but for the fact that Lampert was invested in it. So he lost a few $1 billion personally on this whole deal. And he's not gonna see a whole lot of that back. Okay, so what the point of this is that we all think about bankruptcy as this sort of, that's never gonna happen to me. We're gonna run our business so that it goes bankrupt. That's for other companies that do bad things, make bad decisions, fail, whatever. But it can happen really quickly to a very successful company, and it can happen slowly over time to a company that was once very dominant. The road is littered with these giant companies that at one time were big titans of industry that later went bankrupt. Kodak is an example of that. General Motors is an example of that. And we actually just saw this week they're going to close a bunch of factories and stop and lay off a bunch of people because they're worried about the slowdown in their sales, and they're trying to be proactive about it. So the point of it is you always have to be thinking about it. It can happen to anyone. It can happen to Lehman. It can happen to everybody else. Okay? Any questions about Sears or Lehman? Does that make sense? You see how that formula works, how the boxes work? Keep that visual in mind because it will help you later when you're running a business, if you keep that visual in mind. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the bankruptcy code itself, because the bankruptcy code is a federal statute. Going all the way back to week 2, that's why I say that bankruptcy is kind of the exclamation point on the class, because it references almost everything we've talked about in one way or another. Going all the way back to the Constitution actually gives Congress the power to regulate bankruptcy. As a result of that, bankruptcy is only federal. There is no such thing as a state bankruptcy law. Remember when we talked about securities laws a few weeks ago? And I said that there's a federal securities law, and then all the states have their own securities laws as well. So there's actually 2 systems, and we've seen that in a number of other examples of things we've talked about. Bankruptcy is an exception to this. It's only federal. It's only federal law. And it's also a unique jurisdiction of the federal bankruptcy courts. So you can't walk into you can't walk into the district court and file bankruptcy. You have to file in a bankruptcy court, a specific court that does nothing but hear bankruptcy cases. There's actually even a little bit of competition among the courts for the filings. When there's a big filing, they sometimes, like Enron filed in New York, even though they were based in Houston. There was kind of there's some competition among the different areas, different bankruptcy courts in different places in the country. But Lehman, of course, filed in New York because that's where they were located. But the point of it is you file bankruptcy in a federal bankruptcy court, and that's it. And federal bankruptcy code determines what happens in a bankruptcy, right? So what kinds of assets are dischargeable or not dischargeable, who gets paid first, who gets paid second. That's all decided by Congress and included in the bankruptcy code, which they change from time to time. They actually, it was a few years ago, the credit card companies lobbied Congress to make it harder to discharge credit card debt in a bankruptcy, and they were successful in doing that. So it is harder now to discharge credit card debt than it used to be. What people used to do is, if they knew that they were in trouble, they'd go out and buy a bunch of stuff and then file bankruptcy. And now there's a clawback, so they can go back and if you ran up debt a certain period of time before you filed bankruptcy, you can't discharge that debt. So the credit card companies lobbied the government to do that, and they made that change. Okay, so, but the big reason we have bankruptcy is what we call discharge. Now, we talked about discharge before in another context. Does anybody remember where we talked about discharge? And again, remember, this is why bankruptcy touches almost everything we've talked about. Anybody remember? No? Okay, it's getting late in the semester, right? Everybody's tired. It was in contracts. Remember when we talked about contracts and you have an obligation? And how do you normally discharge an obligation in a contract? What's the normal way? What?
By performing.
By performing, right? So in my example of the airplane, performance would have been paying all of the lease payments, right? That would have been performance. Now, if we breach, then that's a version of discharge, right? Which allows the creditor to then sue for damages for the lost money. In bankruptcy, certain contracts can be discharged by order of the court. So this is where the real power of bankruptcy comes in. There are some companies who have filed for the sole purpose of getting out of leases or union contracts, because both of those are dischargeable in bankruptcy. So if, for example, you had, this was the company I worked at, we didn't end up filing, but we came close, and one of the reasons why we did it was if we would have filed, we could have just handed over the airplane to the lessor and said, we're discharging the difference between the remaining payments and the jet, and they would probably have had to accept that in bankruptcy. But it would require a court order to do it. We also had branches all across the country, some of which were losing money, but we had signed a lease. So we couldn't get out of the lease, but if we would have filed bankruptcy, we could close the office and walk away from the lease. So in some cases, it allows a company to get out from under these obligations that are weighing it down. So I always tell the story at that company I worked at. It's one of the things that drives me crazy, but I had the guy who was responsible for opening new branches came into my office on a Friday afternoon, all breathless about having to sign this lease before Monday for this new location. And it was in Braintree, Massachusetts, which is outside of Boston. And so I had to quickly drop everything I was doing, review the lease, and then they signed it. And then the branch manager, the regional manager, comes in the next week and says, "That's a terrible location. I don't understand why we opened there. We need to open the branch somewhere else." Well, we had just signed a 5-year lease. So we were stuck with that branch, which we now knew was a bad location for 5 years. And companies make idiot decisions like that all the time, and too many of those idiot decisions over time can hurt the business to the point where it might make sense to file bankruptcy to discharge those obligations and then emerge from bankruptcy if you can reorganize without these obligations that are hurting you. Okay, but remember, not all debt is dischargeable. Like we mentioned earlier, student loans is not dischargeable. Most taxes are not dischargeable. Some are, but most are not. So you can't discharge everything. So there's a formula, a calculation that goes into figuring out whether it makes sense to file bankruptcy or not. And that's what bankruptcy lawyers will do for you if you go and talk to them. So there's also certain property that's exempt from creditors. So when creditors want to liquidate the assets, they can't liquidate everything. In a pure liquidation of a company, they can. They sell everything. If the company's reorganizing, then the company gets to keep some of the assets to allow it to operate. And the court is the one that decides what assets they get to keep and which ones get discharged. But some assets are non-dischargeable, and some are exempt. Some liabilities are non-dischargeable, and some assets are exempt from attachment by the creditors. And if you look in the book, if those of you have your book, on page 204, there's a list of all of the kinds of assets that are exempt under the statute. So, for example, if you own a house and you file for personal bankruptcy, you get to keep $22,975 of the value of the equity if there is any. So they can force you to sell your house, but they can't take all of the money to apply to the loan. They have to leave you with at least $22,975. So that's what an exemption means. You can have one motor vehicle, but you can only have $3,675 worth of value in it. So you can sort of go down the list and you can kind of see, in some cases, if you don't own a house, you only own one car that's not worth very much, and you have a bunch of credit card debt, bankruptcy is going to be great, because you can discharge all the credit card debt, assuming it's not subject to the clawback, and you can keep your car. If you own your house and there's no equity in it, you can sometimes keep your house even out of bankruptcy. So there's a whole formula that goes into it, and it's all based on what the bankruptcy code says is exempt. If you look on page 209, there's a list of priority, and that is the list in the liability box of who gets paid first. And what you'll notice is there's a lot of social policy that's built into the bankruptcy code. So, for example, the first priority claim is unsecured claims for domestic support obligations. So, if you owe domestic support, that gets paid even before secured creditors get paid. But generally, and then there's other things in there like that. Administrative expenses of the bankruptcy get paid first. So sometimes you can consume up the whole value of the assets just in administering the bankruptcy, and even the secured creditors don't get anything. But generally, there's this group of debt that gets paid first, but generally it's secured debt followed by unsecured debt, right? And we all know what that means, right? From 2 weeks ago, what's secured debt? What does that mean for debt to be secured? Collateral. It's attached to a particular asset. So in the case of the airplane, the lender who's lent against a specific asset, they get that asset, and they get to pay themselves from that asset before any unsecured creditor gets paid. Okay, so that's what we mean by priority, is a list of who gets paid and in what order. And it's just, remember that it's generally secured before unsecured. And then there are these categories of things that are above that, like domestic support obligations. But just to give you an example, a company I work for called BUSA303 went bankrupt, and I was just rewatching The Big Short the other day, and it's that company's in the movie. There's a scene where they show BUSA303's building, the building I used to work in a news story about its bankruptcy. And when it went bankrupt, some of the employees lost some money. And this is a good example of two different kinds of claims. So if you have a 401k, for example, a retirement plan, every month they take some money out and put it in this plan. They actually take the cash from the company and transfer it to to a trustee, so the company doesn't actually own the money. So if the company goes bankrupt, the employees still don't lose that money. But we also had what was called a deferred compensation plan for senior executives. And this one guy I knew who worked there, who was literally a rocket scientist. There's this guy from Russia who was literally, before he came to work for us, worked at JPL, and he was just a numbers guy. And he maxed out the deferred comp plan. And what deferred comp was, you could say, all right, I make $200,000 a year. I want to defer 100,000 of that to some other time. And so they only paid him half of his salary. He deferred the rest. And the reason you would do this is because it reduces your taxes, and you can take the money out later when your tax bracket is lower and then pay less tax. And that's why he did it. But the deferred compensation plan is not a segregated account like a 401k. So when the company went bankrupt, he lost all of that deferred comp. Because he was an unsecured creditor for that deferred compensation. Yeah?
So what happened to the like Sears pension?
Yeah,
Pension?
right. Pension plans, they are partially guaranteed by the government, but not fully. So the guaranteed portion of it is subject to this formula. And pensioners usually take a haircut on their pensions here. And where they get hurt even more than the pension usually is things like health insurance. Because the company has this obligation to pay health insurance, well, that's just a contractual obligation. And if the company doesn't exist anymore, it stops making the payments for the insurance. And those retirees now, not only do they get a smaller pension, but they have to pay for their own health insurance. So yeah, that's a big problem with a company like Sears that's been around so long and I read somewhere they have like 5 times as many pensioners as employees or something like that, because they've just been around for so long. They have so many people who've retired and are on benefits like that. So all kinds of downsides to this. Lots of people get hurt, lots of people lose money, but in the end, we have this process so that we can reorganize these companies or get rid of them if they're not worth saving. Okay, any questions on that? This is just a brief chart. It's actually, I guess I could do a better job of formatting it. This just summarizes what's in the book about the 3 major chapters of bankruptcy. The first one is chapter 7, and that's what we call liquidation. And that's where we just say, sell all the assets, pay the debt, and be done. In the personal example, of course, you can't just get rid of a person. If you do liquidation individually, it means you sell everything you own, pay off your debts, and discharge everything else, and then you start fresh. Minus the exemptions, of course. You get to keep the exempted property. So in the recession, a lot of people did this. I have a friend who did this, and it destroys your credit. But if you're smart about it, what she did was she did this, she wiped out all of her debts, and then she immediately went out and leased a car. And she had to pay an enormous, crazy rate for this car. It was like crazy. But she did it for 2 years, made every payment, and turned the car back in. And all of a sudden now her credit starts to go back because she's demonstrating an ability to repay. And she just kept doing this. And a couple years later, her credit was back over 700 after filing bankruptcy. So it is possible to recover from it. It used to be like one of these things where you were scarred for life having filed bankruptcy. But nowadays it's more common. And in fact, there's some research out there that says that if you look at a lot of successful entrepreneurs, a large percentage of them have a bankruptcy in their history. So failure itself is not the end of the world, but it does cause some, it does have consequences. So not everyone can file. You can't just say, I don't feel like paying my debt, so I'm going to file for bankruptcy. You actually have to qualify for it. You actually have to not make enough money to pay your debts. It can't just be that you don't want to pay them. You have to actually not be able to pay them, using the formula from the statute. And then what happens when a bankruptcy is filed, and by the way, it can be filed by the creditors. So sometimes the debtor doesn't want to file, but the creditors want to hurry up and get everything in bankruptcy before the assets erode further. So the creditors can actually file the bankruptcy, force the debtor into bankruptcy if they want to, in certain circumstances. And then what happens is a trustee is appointed. So the court appoints a third person, a bankruptcy trustee, and that person now has the responsibility to operate either the company if it's a business or to take over the assets if it's a person. So the owner of the assets you no longer own your assets when you file. They get put into a trust that is overseen by the court, and the trustee decides what property to sell, what property to keep, and who to pay, and does all of this with court supervision. So the court doesn't actually do all this work. This trustee does most of the work. And sometimes you get a good trustee, and sometimes you get a bad one. I had a client who filed and got this like crazy trustee that was making all of these claims, and what some trustees will do sometimes is actually sue the debtor because they think that they took money out, they have money hidden somewhere. They'll even sometimes, and this is what happened in the Madoff case, everybody remember the Madoff case? The trustee actually sued people who had pulled money out. Not even Madoff himself, but investors that had put money in and then took out more than they put in. The trustee went and sued those people for that difference and got the money back and distributed it to the other investors who lost money. So that's what a trustee does, tries to maximize the value of the estate and pay out as much as possible to the debtors. And then in a 7, once it's done, then everything, and the court approves it, all dischargeable debt that hasn't been paid goes away. It's like it doesn't exist. You walk away from it. In a reorganization, what you do is you get rid of some debt, but you try to save the company. Or in this case, sometimes it's you can do it individually too. You try to reorganize. You get rid of debts that are, a lot of the, like for example, Sears. What they're trying to do, and this is actually really interesting, so pay attention to this after the class. Sears, the company, wants to reorganize. They want to sell a bunch of non-performing stores, shrink the size of the company down, and whack a bunch of the debt, and emerge from bankruptcy with fewer assets and fewer liabilities, and as a smaller, profitable company. The banks, on the other hand, are saying, that's not going to work. We think all they're going to do is go lose more money. And so the banks are pushing for a pure liquidation. Just sell it all and pay us what you can, because the assets are not going to be worth more later than they are today. So there's actually a fight between the management of the company and the debt holders to determine which chapter they're going to pursue. And it's up to the court to decide. So the creditors, though, get together in a committee and make these decisions, and they don't always agree. In big bankruptcies, the creditors fight with each other, and it's a mess. And it goes on for a long time and costs a lot of money. And then Chapter 13 is a special kind of version of bankruptcy that's just for individuals. Companies can't file this, and it requires a debtor to make payments for a certain period of time, and then after that, everything else is discharged. So it's kind of it's a version of 11, but it's just for individuals, and it works in certain cases. But the point to remember is there's different chapters of bankruptcy, and there's others besides this, but these are the 3 that the book covers, and that are the most common. And it's not always, you don't always know which chapter it's going to end up being, depending on the situation. Any questions on that? On 7 versus 13 versus 11? There's actually in the area of tax, there's a strategy called a Chapter 20. There's no such thing as a Chapter 20, but some taxes can be discharged if they're a certain amount old. And so what happens is you file Chapter 7, you liquidate those, and then you file a 13 and do a payment plan on the rest. And so it's actually using bankruptcy twice to achieve an objective. So it gets very complicated and very tricky, and that's why bankruptcy lawyers do nothing but bankruptcy. Okay, so, perfect, got 5 minutes. So why do we have this system? Why do we let debtors borrow money and then file a case with the court and allow them to just walk away from their debts? Why would we do that? Why would we have a... What's that?
Fresh start.
Fresh start, right? The alternative, if we didn't do it, would be what? What would happen if we didn't have bankruptcy? What's that?
No one would be willing to start a business.
No one would start a business because you'd be afraid that if you failed, you would never be able to recover, right? So there's a certain amount of public policy built into this of allowing companies that fall out of favor to reorganize. Now, is it fair though that equity holders should take all of this loss? If you invest money in a company and it goes under, a lot of people are going to get paid before you get anything, and equity holders almost always get zero. Does that system make sense? Do you think that's fair? Yeah? Why?
Because then they're not taking your money, like your personal money, right?
Okay.
If you invest money into it, they're not taking your personal money.
Right. All you stand to lose is what you invested. Yeah. Right.
Because liabilities is like other companies, which is like in general produce everything.
Okay. So these are generally going to be other participants in the economy as opposed to investors. Okay. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah.
Kind of burn up liabilities really quick and then moving back. But like with the liabilities, they're debts that are owed to them
Right.
from the company.
Right.
Whereas with the equity, it's a risk that you took upon yourself with your own money to try and get a gain, but
Right.
you know what's expected, so you know that there could be a loss.
Right. Okay. So you make a calculation
Yeah.
and you expect a greater return, right? Well, what happens if the company is super successful? Let's say you invest some money in a company early on and it borrows some money, but it's massively successful. Do the holders of the debt get any more money if the company is successful? If you lend money, if you lend $50 million at 10%, and the company does way better and has way more cash, do you get any more than 10%? No, you get a fixed rate of return if you're the lender. Well, what happens to the shareholders? After they pay the debt, do the shareholders get they get a much bigger return, right? They get everything on top of what the lenders are owed. So the trade-off is that if you lend money, you get a fixed rate of return and a higher priority of repayment. But if you invest money, in exchange for this risk that you take the first hit, you get all the upside over the debt. And that's why the system works the way it is. Now, you might argue whether that's fair or not, but that's the deal, and that is part of the decision that you have to make when you're making an investment. So what I want all of you to understand is that when you are investing your money, you need to know where you are on this list and make sure that you are getting paid enough premium to compensate you for the risk that you're taking. That's the key intuition, and that's really sort of this intuition behind the whole class. When you think about it, if you sign a contract, it's to sell I always use this example, to sell a pallet of bananas, right? If you're selling this pallet of bananas and you don't have a security interest in it, there's a higher risk of non-payment, so you are relatively low on this list, which means you need to charge enough to compensate you for the fact that some of your customers are not going to pay, and you probably, if they don't pay, you probably won't ever see that money. And you just have to acknowledge that reality exists, and you have to price your products and your services to account for it. Okay, so does anybody think bankruptcy is unfair? Do you think the system is unfair? That we should change it? Everybody like it? Nobody wants to take the bait on this one? Fair, unfair, good, bad? Anyone? Nobody? The end of the semester. So I answered the last one, how you take it into account. It's always there, you always have to think about it, price it into everything that you do, and take it into account with respect to everything that you are doing, from how you form your business, to whether and when you pay your employees, to the contracts you enter into. It affects everything that we've talked about in this class. Okay, I think everybody's tired. We'll wrap it there. We'll see you then next Tuesday. We are not meeting on Thursday, next Tuesday. And don't forget about the Executive Leadership Series tonight at 6 o'clock. All right? Have a nice week. We'll see you and have some candy, and we'll see you next week.